Professor Gomez, welcome to the conversation.
Well, thank you. Thank you for inviting me.
Wonderful, wonderful. How is work and your family doing?
Well, it's been a difficult summer, I think, for all of us. It's a difficult political environment within to operate in conjunction with this pandemic. So we're doing the best that we can.
Oh, wonderful, wonderful. I'm happy to have you for this conversation, particularly to discuss your book, Exchanging Our Country Marks. I believe this was an outstanding publication. We are actually using the book for the course that we are teaching here, a history of modern Africa, and it's quite exciting that we have assigned the work itself. So I'm happy to have this conversation with you. But before we get to discuss about the book, I would want you to just briefly discuss. I understand that you are currently the director and the founding director of two very important organizations, that is to say, the Center for the Study of Africa and the African Diaspora, as well as the Association of the Study of the Worldwide African Diaspora. Can you just briefly describe the work that you do with these two organizations?
Sure. Let's start with the Association for the Study of the Worldwide African Diaspora first, or ASWAD, the acronym. That organization has been in existence for 20 years now. It's doing very well. It meets every other year. It has met all over the world. It is primarily an organization for academics, but other cultural workers, community members are certainly welcome to participate. And the organization has grown really rather exponentially over the 20 years. I happen to be involved with its foundation and early development. But the organization is a democratic organization in that the leadership is voted in, there's a rotation of officers and so forth. So I am only tangentially involved with the organization so far as any sort of oversight is concerned. I really don't have anything to do with those decisions. It has a president, Trent Vinson, and it has officers and a board, and so I'm just pleased to see the progress and the growth of the organization since 2000. The Center for the Study of Africa and the African Diaspora is entering its third year. It's headquartered at New York University, where I work, and the idea there is to promote scholarly interest in both Africa and the African diaspora, and to generate, conversations both within these fields and across these fields. And so we bring in scholars and speakers and cultural workers and so forth toward this end. We have biennial conferences. We have a postdoc that is designed for scholars who are living outside of the US and Europe, whose focus is either on Africa and the African diaspora. We have launched an institute for secondary school teachers to help them to incorporate and develop materials on Africa and the African diaspora into their curricula. Let's see what else we have book launches and so forth. And but the idea of the center, or CSOD, is to pursue collaborations between the academy and other cultural workers, potentially government officials and so forth, to explore and implement remedies to some of the challenges that we face as African descendant people.
Oh, wonderful, wonderful. You are doing a very good job. That's very excellent. So can you just give us a brief synopsis of your book and its major themes?
Well, so Exchanging Our Country Marks was published in 1998. It was the culmination of work for at least 10 years. And, you know, it developed out of a very kind of straightforward question, and that is, who are these Black people in the United States? And that is to say, can we understand this experience and the meaning of our circumstances beyond this notion of Blackness, or can we further explore Blackness? And more specifically, I was interested in the connection between the African American experience and Africa. And in graduate school, I was trained in African history, so my orientation is toward Africa, and I thought that you know, it was time to try to bring together these conceptual worlds and realities to create a kind of single field of analysis by which we could explore these connectivities. And so that was the kind of origin of the project. Let me say this differently. I was very dissatisfied with notions of African American identity. And growing up in this country, I really didn't necessarily understand what that was, but more specifically, I always felt both, well, I don't know, I always felt that there was much more to my relationship to the African continent, and I wanted to explore that. And so as a historian, you know, I wanted to take a look at those connections in the, you know, in the historical periods.
Oh, wonderful, wonderful. Thank you very much. So what would you consider to be your sources for this narrative? What were your sources?
Well, my approach was, if one was forced to characterize it, I imagine it kind of falls into a kind of Clifford Geertz kind of thick description approach. That is to say, because of the wide-ranging nature of the project, I had to look at a variety of different kinds of sources. I had to look at shipping data, depending upon, because the book moves, if you will, from a kind of African antecedent into subsequent New World realities. And so I had to look at data relating to the transatlantic trade. For one part of the book, I had to look at folklore. I had to look at runaway slave ads. I had to look at plantation records. There were some manuscripts. There's an important chapter in the book that looks at Muslims in what becomes the United States, and so that required an examination of information both from West Africa as well as from what becomes the United States, and there was some manuscript, Arabic manuscript work involved with that. So, you know, the sources were, you know, kind of wide ranging because of the kind of evolving nature of the project.
Oh, I see. I'm sure that you may have faced some challenges in the process of data collection for this narrative. And if so, what were these challenges, and how did you go about remedying the challenges to come up with a fascinating narrative like this?
Well, this is so. What I was interested in this project, it was trying to establish these correspondences with as much specificity as I could possibly demonstrate.
Mhm.
That is to say, beyond the notion of of being Black, or beyond the notion of being of African descent, what can we make much more specific kinds of connections? So there were challenges there because you can't always determine precisely what populations and what communities are being affected by the transatlantic trade, precisely who is being transported via that trade. So that was challenging.
Mhm.
And so, one of the things, for example, West Central Africa, with respect to Congo, Angola, um, I am reticent to kind of apply specific sorts of ethnic terms to persons coming out of that region, and I have to was required to just kind of refer to the region, if you will. Another challenge we've concerned trying to understand the importation of Africans into New Orleans and the lower Mississippi basin. That was very, very tricky. And now remember now, this is prior to the launching of the slave trade database online, formerly referred to as the Du Bois database. So, I was really working with, kind of raw data. And that was challenging to understand precisely what kinds, the various waves of importations coming in particular into the lower Mississippi basin. Another challenge, which I think remains the case, is trying to really get a grasp on the regional exchange of Africans. That is to say, people moving from the Caribbean into the North American mainland and back. Who was involved, how many numbers, and so forth and so on. That was a challenge for me in the 1990s. And I haven't been following that conversation very closely because I have been involved once more in the history of the African continent itself, in particular West Africa, more recently. But I try to do some reading with respect to the so-called slave trade and so forth. And I don't think that literature has advanced terribly far with respect to these interconnections between various parts of the Americas. I think a lot more work needs to be done there.
Oh, I see. Well, looking at your book, one can notice that the transformation of identities is at the center of the ideas that you talk about. And so I'd like to understand how you conceptualized and perceived the idea of African identity itself.
Mm-hmm. So it's an excellent question. And I think that it's important to understand that the history of and the experiences of Africans, African communities in West Africa, West Central Africa, Southeastern Africa, indeed the entire continent, was constantly in motion. That is to say, the continent itself was in various states of transition as a consequence of these external trades and the evolution of religious ideas and political innovation and so forth. And so we have to understand that, because I think there is the sense that it continues to this day that Africa was this kind of static space in which nothing happened, until Europeans came there. And in fact, that nothing could be further from the truth. So once we understand that, then this becomes a much more dynamic kind of undertaking. That is to say, people taken out of the African continent and brought into the Americas in the 16th century, okay, we're coming out of certain circumstances and experiences, which were not necessarily the same as those in the 17th century, in the 18th century, in the 19th century. And so that's important to understand that the contexts are constantly changing. The second thing is to try to wrap our minds around, what is an African beyond the fact that these people are coming from what's referred to as the African continent.
Exactly.
That is to say, how did they understand themselves? And so we have to kind of delve into the many ways by which persons inhabiting the continent saw themselves in relationship to their community, saw themselves in relationship to other societies, also on the continent, and so forth. So that's a very, very fascinating story. But then, so once we kind of try to get some sense of that, then we've got to try to understand, okay, now once you bring all of these disparate people into this new world, how do they now see themselves? How do they see themselves? How do they work through that? And so I think that's one of the driving themes of the book. That is how self-reflection changes and evolves during the period of slavery in the United States. And one of the things that I'm trying to argue is that certainly there is a level of imposition. People are enslaved. People are, kind of reduced to a set of circumstances in which they have in common, servitude. And I understand all of that. But I think that there's much more involved. That is to say that there are processes underway, experiences that Africans and their descendants go past through that force them to raise the question of who they are in relationship to each other and in relationship to this environment. That is to say, the sense of who they are is far less a matter of what planters and white folks in the society think they are. It's less that than who they see themselves to be, how they define themselves. And so I'm trying to trace this through the various periods. And if I may, I think that there were certain moments and experiences which were really existential challenges for Africans and their descendants. One was how do, for example, how do persons from Congo, Angola, how do they understand the relationship to people from Senegambia, with whom they have had no relationship whatsoever? They're involved in different languages, they speak different cultures. They speak different languages, they're involved in different cultures. Other than the fact that they have a lot of melanin in their skin, how are they related?
Yeah.
So that's an interesting thing. And I think that Africans, in particular in the United States, as opposed to some of the other New World sites in which you have greater concentrations of persons from similar backgrounds and communities, in what becomes the United States, you really have quite an eclectic gathering of people from West Africa, West Central Africa. And so the question is for me, how did they relate to one another? That's the first thing. And so I try to trace how they work through that, how they work through their differences. That is not something that planters could impose upon them. They had to work through
to figure it out
how they relate to one another. And I was very interested in that, in those processes. The second thing, I think, which really represented a kind of existential crisis for this kind of evolving community, was death and the meaning of death, because it was you know, it was something with which people lived on a daily basis. And when the African-born died, you know, generally speaking, the African-born had a sense of the meaning of death, and it tended to be related to the land of their birth. So the challenge then becomes, what happens when you die in this foreign land?
Yeah.
How was that to be understood? I think that was it was a real moment of crisis that people had to kind of negotiate all of the time. And then the question then becomes, the flip side of that is, okay, and what about their children who are born in this new space? Who are they? What are they? And what happens to their souls at their deaths? So these were very interesting kinds of questions for me. The other thing the other challenge I think that I think that that Africans and their descendants had to face was the meaning of the births of individuals who were so-called biracial. Who were these people? And to which community did they belong? Yeah, I think that these were challenges. And I think that one of the spaces and you can see the conflict, that is to say, how Africans and their progeny kind of tried to resolve these conflicts. You could see the level of the conflict, for example, in such categories as language. That was very interesting to me, because what you saw was that beyond African-born persons, first generation, second generation Black people were not speaking English, or were not speaking it very well. And that suggests to me that there was resistance to the signification of adopting this language. That is to say that that English and perhaps in other zones, French, Portuguese, Spanish, represented a kind of cultural imposition that people resisted. And so they were very intent upon taking this language, infusing it with the syntax and grammar of African languages to the extent that they could remember them, could speak them, and so forth. And so language was an area in which Africans and their descendants fought to kind of create their own sense of who they were. But of course, another important area was religion. And here you have people coming into the Americas practicing ancestral religion or Islam, or even possibly Catholicism coming out of Congo. So they're all placed into this similar circumstance. And, you know, the question becomes, how do they understand their reality? And you know, what kind of religion will they practice? And what develops in many instances is this kind of amalgamated approach to the divine. And the late, great Sterling Stuckey worked through this long ago in his pioneering studies on the ring shout. And what I simply did was to take that idea and try to further it, try to examine it more closely. And I do think that in the religious space of the ring shout, what you had, the beautiful thing about the ring shout is that it was the liturgical style was something that was common to many, many Africans, wherever they came from. People were familiar with, rings and moving in rings and dance and spirit possession and so forth. And so the beautiful thing about the ring shout is that people from all kinds of backgrounds with varying beliefs, specific beliefs, could all participate, in that ceremony or similar ceremonies. And I do think that that was a mechanism by which people began to redefine who they were, and they began to see themselves as occupying, as being a member, as being members of, if not a same community, a similar community. And you see that the book begins with the revolt of Denmark Vesey in Charleston, 1822, and I found that to be just a fascinating moment, because it's very clear that you have persons, leaders, Monday Gill, Gullah Jack, Denmark Vesey, so forth, people who are from different parts of the world. Mm-hmm. They're all there in Charleston. They have different perspectives on life. Mm-hmm. And they have to somehow find a way to come together and collaborate, okay, to achieve an insurrectionary purpose. And that in and of itself, in a nutshell, if you will, represents, if you will, the African-American experience. That is to say, people coming together. You know, there is this notion in the United States that if you have any African descent, it made you a Black person. The so-called one-drop rule. I have to tell you, I haven't found that rule. Now, I'm not saying it doesn't exist.
Yeah, okay.
I haven't found it. Mm-hmm. I have not found it. Mm-hmm. What I have found instead is tremendous diversity. I found all sorts of approaches to the question of race in what becomes the United States. Mm-hmm. And my contention is that the African descendant, by and large, create this identity they created, they generated, they initiated. And what's lingering in the ether, because the study stops in the 1830s.
Yeah.
But what's lingering in the ether, well beyond this period, well beyond the antebellum period, well into Reconstruction, well into the beginning, the turn of the century and into the beginning of the 20th century. What's lingering in the ether is, what is our relationship to Africa? And people have to come to terms with this issue. They will answer it variously. Okay, and we know that class enters into the picture. And so those who are more mobile, more aspirational with respect to being incorporated into the society, into becoming Americans and so forth, will tend to eschew any African background. They don't necessarily want to have anything to do with Africa.
Yeah.
Okay, because it is viewed as atavistic and so forth and so on by white America. But I don't want to, paint, but even within, kind of more mobile classes, you still have the question of what is the relationship of the Black community to Africa. And it is something that, is still ongoing. It's still unfolding. Okay, I find it very interesting. I find it very, very interesting that here we are in the 21st century, well into the 21st century.
Mm-hmm.
And if anything, the connection to the African continent is growing.
Mm-hmm.
It is deepening. People are becoming more and more interested and involved and connected
Mm-hmm.
with Africa.
Mm-hmm.
And it's multivalent, it's complicated, it's multi-sided. I think, but I find it just to be a fascinating kind of phenomenon. I'm trying to understand it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, thank you very much for that response. But now, looking at the numbers themselves, one can be able to note that Africans were enslaved in significant portions of numbers. It was largely African people that were victim of this enslavement era. So, what can you say about the fact that why was it that in the mind of the enslavers, it was the Africans that were much more suitable for slavery?
Well, it's a good question. I don't know if it was so much that there was something about Africans
Mm-hmm.
that made them more suitable, as opposed to just the economics of the entire system.
Oh, yeah.
Europeans came into the Americas, and not to be too coarse, but immediately, embarked upon a campaign of appropriation.
Mm-hmm.
And in that campaign, First Nation populations, so-called Amerindians, Native Americans, did not necessarily fare well.
Mm-hmm.
Europeans will bring into the New World a very new disease environment against which indigenous populations had no immunities, and so you did have a significant percentage of First Nation communities dying just simply as a consequence of coming into contact with these new disease environments.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things, of course, that Africans had in common with Europeans was that they were from the so-called Old World, and so some of these, so they were not necessarily as impacted
Mm-hmm.
as Native American society, which is not to say that they didn't die, because they did. Africans died from disease. Africans died from being overworked. Africans I mean, it was just a horrible situation for our people. It was just a horrible situation, horrible. And but relative to Native American populations, I do think that Africans tended to fare a little better in these workspaces, and I think that Europeans were skilled in working out the economics. They could work out the numbers such that it simply became it became profitable.
Mm-hmm.
And to import Africans, enslave them, basically work them to death within a period of 3 to 5 years, depending upon where you were, but in particular in the Caribbean, and just simply replace them. Mm-hmm. So they were able to work out the numbers.
Yeah, I see. Now, looking at it, looking at the experience of
the other thing too I want to mention is that Africans did bring skills with them, agricultural skills. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And for example, with respect to rice production, indigo production, and so forth. Many African societies, those in West Africa in particular, parts of West Africa, they knew how to grow rice, they knew how to produce indigo and so forth. So they brought those skills with them.
Mhm.
And those skills were valid. That is to say, they would come into places like the lowlands in South Carolina and Georgia and so forth. And they weren't taught how to grow rice, indigo. They, in fact, brought those skills with
Those
them.
skills with them. Yeah, yeah, I see. I see.
Mhm.
Thank you. And thank you very much for raising that. So
Mhm.
I'm pretty sure that these enslaved people, in particular Africans, did retain some form of African identity when they came. And
Mhm.
they were able to simultaneously create some form of new ones under circumstances of enslavement. How
Mhm.
did this occur at the very same time?
How did what?
How were they able to retain their African identity as well as create a new form of identity while they were enslaved?
Well, this is an interesting question. Now, this gets into, some kind of theoreticals um, about which scholars have been in debates for decades. And I think that so to begin, I think that fundamentally we need to understand that culture is dynamic.
Mhm,
It is always changing, no matter where it is,
mhm,
whether it's in the African continent or the Americas or Europe or Asia or what have you. So if we can get past this notion of a kind of African ethnocentric present, then we can better understand that all of these societies were in motion. All of these societies were in motion. And with that said, what comes through the creation of subsequent notions of corporate identity among African descendant people? What comes through that experience are sensibilities, approaches, general kinds of orientations. I think this is what comes through.
mhm,
So in instances, specificity, the details, for example, of a language, the details, for example, of a religion, may not necessarily continue on from century to century.
mhm,
But what may continue on, and in a different form, is a sort of approach
mhm,
to a particular phenomenon or practice. This is very obvious, for example, in religious practice, right? Where in relation to assuming that that people of European ancestry introduced notions of Christianity to Africans and their descendants, and that's a very complicated subject.
mhm,
But let's just take that as a useful point to begin. That Africans would infuse, the liturgy of that practice.
mhm,
Um, And so Europeans have a very staid approach to Christianity, a very stiff, motionless kind of approach to Christianity. That is rejected by Africans and their descendants, and so you have a lot of movement. On the part of Africans, you have a lot of engagement with a real deep sense of spirituality, that the spirit world is very much present. And so you have those kinds of approaches. The same thing with language, and the linguistic scholars have pretty much demonstrated that this is the case, not only in the US, but also, you know, in other parts of the Americas. That is to say that Africans will bring their own sense of syntax to the speaking of Portuguese, Spanish, French, and English. And so, so now people are speaking a language. They're speaking English in a certain kind of way. They're practicing quote unquote Christianity in a certain kind of way. They're not necessarily always aware of the fact that, you know, what they're doing has African antecedents, but that's not really critical. Yeah. So I would say that in this country, the ways in which they approach cultural practice is very much informed by the African antecedent. But that's the thing, because what happens is over time, people begin to ask the question, well, why do we practice religion this way?
Exactly, yeah.
Why do we speak the English language this way?
Mm-hmm.
You know, and that leads then to further interrogation of this relationship to the African continent.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Wonderful, wonderful. Thank you very much for your responses, Professor Michael Gomez.
Let me just say one more thing about this.
Oh yeah, sure.
This is not just confined to the realm of the cultural. This is also highly political.
Mm-hmm.
This is highly political. There has always been an effort on the part of what becomes the United States, those who are in control of the economy and the political apparatus, mm-hmm. to require of Black folk to eschew their Africanness, if you will, mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. and whatever that might mean. And so that the notion of being African was always seen as antithetical to American identity, even though the realities would contradict that with respect to, if you listen to the music, if you listen to so-called American music, yeah. If you listen to the way that white Southerners speak the English language and so forth and so on, the African infusion has been substantial. I mean, it has been really quite significant, but people don't necessarily understand it as such. Yeah. And I think that that there's a real wrestling, with the ways in which one can be an American and at the same time understand their relationship to Africa and other people of African descent elsewhere in the world. But this is happening. This is still, the cultural folks, the cultural workers, the musicians, the singers, the artists, the novelists, and so forth tend to be well ahead of the rest of the populations with respect to these connectivities. So it's going to be very interesting because this is always, so it has never been simply a cultural question. It has always entered into the realm of political relations and relations of power.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so I think that it will, and so I see that this is just simply moving forward. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And it's very interesting to me because just to end it, if you look, for example, at Black Lives Matter as a movement is a global movement.
Yeah.
It's very interesting. It's a global movement.
Mm-hmm.
And so that is to say that people, Africans, their descendants, are making these connections on their own. Mm-hmm. And they are relating their experiences. We don't have precisely the same experience. Mm-hmm. We are not precisely the same communities. But there are relations there are correspondences, there are resonances, there are similarities such that I do think that there's potential down the road for the efflorescence of transnational identities as they pertain to, let me rephrase that, African-centered transnational identities. I think there's space for growth in that area.
Wonderful, wonderful. Thank you very much for your responses, Professor Michael Gomez. It was wonderful having you on the conversation. I believe that this will be very helpful for the student community, the academic community at large, and the ordinary person. Thank you very much, and have a good day.
Thank you so much, and thank you for your invitation. And you have a wonderful day as well.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Okay.